Morning, everyone. Welcome to the penultimate day of the New Austrian School series of lectures in Munich. Today, Professor is going to be talking about the significance of the gold standard, and then in the afternoon we have Keith on the inflationary and deflationary spiral. Over to Professor.
Thank you, Sandy. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Today, Sunday, I thought a lighter fare might be appropriate, especially this morning. We have a little bit heavier stuff in the afternoon. So I am going to talk about two papers which are included in your volume. I'll refer you to the article entitled "The Gold Standard" by Ludwig von Mises. I think it's in the early part of the book. And then a second paper with the title "The Significance of the Gold Standard." And this is an edited version of a paper by Walter E. Spahr, who died in 1970, but he was the head of the Department of Economics at New York University for several decades, and was a great monetary scientist. And these are the two papers which I would like to present to you. I find these excellent papers, crystal clear argument, and very valuable source of study. So let's first talk about Ludwig von Mises. This is a two-page excerpt from his great volume entitled Human Action, chapter 17. So I lifted this from it and made just very slight changes, and I know that to read that whole volume is quite an enterprise for every one of us, especially for beginners, but perhaps this article will be a good warm-up and give you desire to go for the whole hog and read the whole work. The very first sentence in this article is something which I already mentioned, and I mentioned it in connection with the silver, the monetization problem. And at that time, I made a confession. I confessed that I, earlier in my career, took a position which was the same as the position of Mises, and also it happened to be the position of Milton Friedman, which was the view that silver was demonetized by the market, and governments were fighting tooth and nail against this. They wanted to keep silver because they were inflationists at heart and in practice, and they considered silver as a great way of diluting the money supply. Now that, when I held this view, was about 20 years ago, and I just took it uncritically, because most monetary scientists have that same view. And then I had occasion, especially last summer, to do my own independent research, and I came to the opposite conclusion. I have talked about this, I'm not going to repeat this, but let me read this sentence of Mises, which sounds very convincing, and as I said, I was convinced myself, but it took quite a bit of work and research to disassociate myself from that view. The monetary doctrines which underpinned the endeavor of governments in trying to salvage bimetallism have misconstrued the market phenomenon in that complete way in which only bureaucrats can misconstrue them. The attempt failed lamentably. It was this failure which gave birth to the gold standard, the emergence of which was a crushing defeat for the governments and their cherished doctrines. So that was the position of Mises, and I accepted that without any reservation. But now I see it differently. As I explained, I just reviewed this very briefly. I now hold the view that the demonetization of silver was done by the governments. By and large, it was the result of a conspiracy. We don't have the full record. It is still kept in secret in government archives. But the suspicion is, and the circumstantial evidence is, that it was a conspiracy between the newly born German Reich, the German Empire, after the Franco-Prussian War, 1871, and the United States, which came out victorious in its civil war against the South. They both had financial resources as a result of their victory in the field, and they both were aspiring. They had ambitions to become a great power, economically, politically, and militarily as well. And the silver standard was a stumbling block in their ambition and plans. Why was it? I briefly indicated that, in my view, silver is not a friend of the governments, as Milton Friedman and myself also believe, but it is an enemy. Why? Because it's widely spread in the various strata. All people have access to silver, and therefore silver cannot be easily controlled. Gold can be controlled much more easily. And I also consider that the silver, that the demonetization of silver, which is actually the destruction of silver, much more than just demonetization, because there was a 60-plus year decline in the silver price from $1.29 an ounce all the way to 25 cents an ounce. It's an 80% reduction in the value, in the price, and therefore in the value of the silver. And more important, even more important than that, was the fact that silver was destroyed as a liquid asset. Before, silver was a monetary commodity, and it was therefore very liquid, in fact, as highly liquid as you can go. And therefore, those who had their wealth in silver had easy access to funds if they needed them. And that was destroyed because silver could be sold at a very, very greatly reduced price, but with a lot of difficulty, just as any other illiquid asset can be sold, but losses are involved, and it takes a great effort and so on. So I am even willing to go to the extreme and say that the so-called demonetization of silver opened a new age, and I call it the age of deflation, because the amount of monetary commodities was reduced. Silver was eliminated, only gold was left. And the whole theory of interest, which we are trying to develop in this course, is based on the idea that there is a marginal bondholder and he's doing arbitrage, and the arbitrage is between the bond market and the gold market. This is a schematic description. You don't have to take that literally, that every saver has a bond to sell, and he would sell it if the rate of interest is suppressed, because they could save in other forms. But I found this as a very good way to describe what is indeed happening. Schematic, but it captures the idea to talk about the arbitrage of the marginal bondholder between the bond market and the gold market. And of course, that's hoarding, and the opposite movement is dishoarding. So when silver was removed by this government conspiracy, but inspired by the international banking cartel, that's very important. They were the main protagonists and advisors and the pushing governments in that direction, that silver should be abolished. Silver as money should be abolished, should be destroyed, and it was very successful. So why did this open a new age, what I call the age of deflation rather than inflation? It did because the amount of monetary commodity, which was the ideal vehicle for this arbitrage of the marginal bondholder, was greatly reduced. Silver was completely eliminated, and only gold remained, and gold was not accessible to the larger part of the population. It was only accessible to the privileged few. Therefore, the ordinary people were completely left out. They could no longer cast a vote in the question, should interest rates be increased, because they had been pushed below the rate of marginal time preference. So this is my present view, and I'm offering it to you with the remark that do your own due diligence. You should study the question, try. I can only tell you what my studies suggest. I cannot pretend to follow any school. I have gone through this, and I am inviting you to do the same, study the question, and come to your own conclusion. I think this is a very important question, not only to understand history, which is one thing and a very useful thing, but also to see the shape of things to come. We want to see the future to some extent, as far as we can see, and I am suggesting it to you that silver is going to make a comeback, and that's imminent. Silver is going to be once more an important monetary metal, and it will be the metal for the vast majority of the people of small means, but whose saving is also very important, and they will be able to cast their vote once more. They have been disenfranchised for now that's 140 years since the demonetization of silver. The small people had no input whatsoever in the determination of the interest rate. Silver is going to make a comeback, and it will give the vote back to the vast majority of population. Now, my remarks should not be interpreted as a kind of speech against gold, something like William Jennings Bryan was, the fiery orator. He talked about the crown of thorns and the cross of gold. He said, "Thou shalt not crucify mankind upon this cross of gold," meaning the gold standard. He called the gold standard cross of gold, and which was a very effective oratorical ploy, but that's very far from me to make any. But silver is going to make a comeback. So to that extent, William Jennings Bryan was right. He was right in calling it the crime of 1873, when the Congress of the United States demonetized silver in an underhanded way, quite unconstitutionally, because Congress did not have the authority to do that, simply because the United States Constitution directly addresses that particular coin, the standard silver dollar, and without an amendment of the Constitution, there is no constitutional way to demonetize silver. In spite of that, they did. All right, so that was the first sentence of that article, but I thought it was important to put it into context. But the rest of this excerpt from Human Action, which you have before you, is an admirable statement of the merits of the gold standard. The gold standard makes division of labor possible to a very large extent. And this may be strange, but it is true, and Mises explains that division of labor has its enemies. Well, most of the blessings which we enjoy in the 21st century are due to division of labor, which means specialization. We have various trades, various professions, and we become more and more proficient in what we are doing, thanks to the possibility that we can concentrate on it. Now, the gold standard was the embodiment of the age of capitalism, increasing welfare, liberty, democracy, both political and economic. It was an international standard as required by international trade in goods and capital. One has to see the blessings which trade between nations and capital investment across boundaries will bring to everybody. I may refer to a recent example when the Soviet Union collapsed and these so-called captive nations, parts of the Soviet Empire, which the Soviets acquired after World War II, they had the chance to use their freedom to develop their economies and give the benefits of greater economic and political freedom to the people. But unfortunately, that wasn't quite successful for several reasons, and the national autarky, which is a technical word, it means that countries refuse to take the benefits of greater division of labor. They want to develop their own national economies. They believe that that is the way towards progress, which is, of course, a very mistaken belief. And it is a tragedy of these nations, perhaps to a lesser or greater degree, not uniformly applied across the board, but the fact is that by and large they did not take this opportunity of greater freedom to help themselves to the benefits of greater division of labor. Now, referring to Mises, all those intent on sabotaging this evolution towards welfare, peace, freedom, democracy, hated the gold standard, hated as much as a human being can hate an institution, not another person, but an institution. And not only because of its economic significance, but in their eyes, the gold standard was the symbol of all those doctrines and policies which they wanted to destroy. In the struggle against the gold standard, much more was at stake than commodity prices and foreign exchange rates. Now then he goes on and looks at different groups, because this is not a homogeneous group, those who oppose the gold standard, but a rather heterogeneous group. Nationalists were fighting the gold standard because they wanted to cut off their countries from the world market and to establish national autarky. Here's that word, autarky, is the national self-sufficiency, which would never be a good substitute for the full division of labor worldwide, ignoring boundaries. Now another group, the interventionist governments and pressure groups, were fighting the gold standard because they considered it the most serious obstacle to their endeavor to manipulate prices and wages. Now he comes to the third one, which is the most fanatical group. And the most fanatical attacks against the gold standard were made by those intent upon credit expansion. For them, credit expansion was a panacea for all economic ills. They thought that all economic ills can be cured in short order by expanding credit, multiplying the quantity of money, and part of it is, of course, reducing the rate of interest. It could lower or even abolish interest, raise wage rates and prices for the benefit of all, except the parasitic capitalist. It could free the state from the necessity of balancing its budget and bring great benefit to the population by freestanding, spending, and the welfare state, and subsidies, and so on. In short, it could make all decent people prosperous and happy. Only the gold standard, that devilish contrivance of wicked men, could prevent mankind from attaining everlasting prosperity. So Mises has this wonderful summary of the anti-gold standard manifesto. These people who are sworn enemies of the gold standard, some of them are very prosperous, have this vision that if they have free rein, if they are not checked by the gold standard, they can do what they want, then it's like a magic, just wave the magic wand and then prosperity will be widespread. And economists, unfortunately, fell for this creed. In fact, not only they applauded it, they were the chief cheerleaders in that movement, but they developed pseudo-theories supporting this idea that if the government could get rid of these gold fetters, then the age of happiness would dawn on earth. Now, ladies and gentlemen, here we are, a little over 40 years after the gold standard was stamped out forcibly in 1971. The gold standard was removed not only in the United States, all over the world. There's not a single country could stay on the gold standard. So we have now a history of over 40 years to review. Did those blessings have arrived? And do we have now this perpetual happiness, freedom from want and misery and so on? Well, we must say that for a few decades during these, we had the impression, at least we were told, that you see, that's what happened. Look at the trade figures, look at the investment, look at the global economy. And also remember that the Soviet Union collapsed during that 4 decades. And that was also considered as a proof that you see. But the day of reckoning was coming. And the day of reckoning came in 2008 when actually the first signal, it's very interesting, came as the increase in the rate of interest which governed the so-called bond insurance. They invented the insurance for government